two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Wayles Browne, my husband, but also a longtime socialist since I recruited him to DSA in the mid 1980s, and an even longer time activist in various areas of human rights. So, Wayles, we're going to talk today about international law. Wayles, why don't you tell us how that begins?
Okay, international law, a topic that I'm not really an expert on, but I noticed that many people I know are very, very far from being experts on it. They've scarcely ever heard of it at all. So I think it's worthwhile talking about international law and what it is. One kind of international law is treaties between countries, otherwise known as conventions between countries, agreements between countries, could be trade agreements, could be contracts. And the way that works is somebody representing country A and somebody representing country B, maybe C, D, E, F, etc., signs a document that says, our countries agree that we will do such and such, or we will not do such and such. And that means they've signed it. They haven't yet made it official. That's a second process called ratifying it. So countries can ratify a treaty that they've signed. And in the US, what that means is the president asks the Senate to approve the treaty, and the Senate votes on it. And now, as soon as country A, B, etc., signs the agreement, they are bound not to do anything that's directly against it. But when they ratify it, they have to live up to it. And now these could be trade agreements, like prices they're going to sell some goods at, or watching over standards for quality of goods, or whatever. Or it could be agreements about legal norms that they're going to apply in dealings with each other. And so it's promises that they have to live up to. There's also another kind of international law, which is called customary international law. And the concept should be a bit familiar to us in the United States, because we inherited a lot of customary law from Britain. Even after the American Revolution, when we separated from Britain, we still had a lot of British traditional law that we felt we had to live up to, ways of having a trial, and what counted as evidence and what wouldn't. And Magna Carta is a document. It wasn't a treaty, but it's a document from English law. And indirectly, it fed into American law. Okay, well, in the same way, sort of, customs that countries have been following for a long time in dealing with each other begin to have the status of customary international law. And international lawyers will say, well, you've always followed this practice and you don't have a good reason to not follow it now. Origins of international law, origins of written international law, sometimes it's traced back to a scholar from the Netherlands named Hugo Grotius or Hugo de Groot. In 1625, he published a book called, in Latin, De Jure Belli ac Pacis, which means about the law of war and peace. And he noticed that countries really did follow some customs, even when they were having wars with each other. And so he tried to figure out what they were and put them down on paper and have something as a reference book. And over the years, there have been more and more actual treaties, actual agreements signed between countries. And so they've gotten to be more and more pieces of international law. And some are things that all countries ought to follow. So some are just between two countries or three countries. And sort of the modern era of international law, we can say, started with the United Nations. The United Nations was a product of the Second World War, and countries got together in San Francisco at the end of the Second World War, and they adopted the Charter of the United Nations. And part of that was how countries ought to treat people, and part of that was how countries ought to treat each other. And it set up the United Nations, different parts of the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council. Some parts meet in New York City, some parts meet in Geneva, Switzerland, a big structure of the United Nations. Okay, in 1948, so that's 3 years after the end of the Second World War, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's a small booklet, looks like this. It's got 30 articles, and each one of them, this either one right or several rights that everybody in the world ought to have. And it's partly the result of lobbying by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of President Roosevelt, who died just at the end of the war. And she got a lot of international lawyers and diplomats from all different countries to agree on a text that would have a list of rights that everyone should have.
I think that's where we get our chant, housing is a human right, as we were chanting just today outside of a law office that doesn't seem to agree with that.
Yes, housing is a human right, healthcare is a human right, education is a human right. Open it at random. Everyone has the right to own property. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, right to take part in the government of your country, right to social security, and economic and social and cultural rights indispensable for your dignity. So rights that everyone really, when you see what they are, it's hard to maintain that people shouldn't have them. Okay, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, wasn't exactly a treaty because countries didn't do this process of signing it and then officially ratifying it, but it was a statement of what the General Assembly thought everyone should have. And almost all the countries in the General Assembly agreed with it. A few didn't. The US did, fortunately. But afterwards, they started turning it into something that would be more binding, that is, into treaties. I should say that some international lawyers say the Universal Declaration has gradually become a customary international law. It's binding because it's gradually become that. But when there's a treaty and countries sign it, then it really is binding. So part of it went into the International Covenant another word for convention, another word for treaty, another word for agreement, covenant, on civil and political rights. And the United States signed and ratified that. Almost all countries did. And it goes a bit more into detail about how everyone should have the right to free expression and free assembly and right to take part in the government without discrimination on the basis of sex, national origin, religious faith, etc. And then another part of the rights were put into the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Political Rights. And the US did sign this. In the end, it didn't ratify it, which meant no president felt secure in sending it to the Senate to be voted on. The president can do that whenever he wants or she wants, but
A problem in this
yeah.
country.
Yes, in the
And
state
I
of New York too.
think I'd like to move on from these more general legal things and get into one crime that is being very much talked about in various contexts today, and that is the question of genocide.
Okay, well, there's some history behind that. I just wanted to say that a good source for finding out about treaties is Wikipedia. That's not always a good source for finding out about everything, but in this case it is, because the United Nations keeps a list of treaties and who signed them and which ones are in force, and then Wikipedia gets its data directly from the United Nations. And so you can look up in Wikipedia the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that also dates from 1948. 1948 was a good year for human rights, the Universal Declaration and the Genocide Convention. The idea for that came from a lawyer originally from Poland named Raphael Lemkin. He was a Jewish war refugee in World War II, and he was able to come to the United States, fortunately. And he invented this term, genocide. The gen part means group of people, let's say, and the side is like, well, homicide is killing a person, suicide is killing oneself, so side means killing somebody. And so genocide would mean killing an entire group of people. And he wrote a treaty, the United Nations worked on it, adopted the language, I think unanimously, in 1948, and then it went out to be signed and ratified by all the different countries, and they just about all did, not quite all. And if I can quote from it, what does genocide mean? What is being prohibited? Well, it covers any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction, in whole or in part, of the group, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And see the reasoning behind that. Imagine some tyrant says, let's kill 30 million people. Well, that's a lousy thing to do. But imagine some tyrant says, let's gather up all the Buddhists and kill 30 million of them. That's an even lousier thing to do, because it might lead to the disappearance of the Buddhists. So that would count as genocide, using a criterion to kill large numbers of people.
Well, I was going to say that taking the children away was practiced in the United States on the Indians, the Native Americans.
It certainly was. It certainly
And
was.
I think into the period, I'm not quite sure when it ended or how it ended.
They continued to be boarding schools for children from Indian tribes, even after the adoption of this treaty, because
Yeah.
the Indians hadn't immediately called the attention of the U.S., of the UN to it. Some American Black activists did, in fact, very early in the existence of the UN. But going back a little more in history, Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer, the Polish-American lawyer, was clearly thinking of the Holocaust when he put this together, but he was also haunted by something that had happened when he was a young boy, namely the massacres of Armenians in the last years of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, just before World War I. And there are lots of examples from previous history. If you read the Old Testament in the Bible, you'll see instances where one tribe would smite another tribe root and branch, meaning killing members of the group, imposing conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction. If you read the bit about the shibboleth, that was the Gileadites trying to kill all the Ephraimites, and their criterion was the Ephraimites couldn't pronounce the word shibboleth, so anyone that couldn't pronounce it, they would kill. Okay, the US and Canada, they certainly did kill members of indigenous tribes. They caused serious harm to them, sometimes by infecting them with smallpox. They shoved them into reservations, which are calculated to bring about their physical destruction, at least in part. They took away the children and sent them to boarding schools in order to make them be Americans or Canadians, as the case may be, and just speak English, and punish them if they would speak Maidu or Hadassa or Crow or Cree or whatever. The Australians did the same thing with their Aborigines. There were hundreds and hundreds of Aborigine in Australia with their own languages. And then the white settlers came from England, and what did they do? More recently, you see China trying to eliminate Tibetans as a separate religious group, trying to eliminate Uyghurs as a separate national group. What do they do? What do the Chinese authorities do? They use mass imprisonment. They limit births by sterilizing people. They educate children and re-educate grown-up people only in Chinese and make them swear allegiance to the Chinese nationality. Israel's treatment of Palestinian Arabs may fit this too. It's certainly not true that the Israelis have killed all the Palestinian Arabs, but they've killed some of them, and they certainly inflicted conditions calculated to bring about their partial destruction. Certainly caused serious bodily or mental harm.
Well, I think initially they claimed that there were no people living in that land, which certainly wasn't true.
That isn't true. That was the slogan of the Zionists, whose ideology was all the Jews moved to Palestine. It's a land without a people, and we're a people without a land. But the trouble was there are Arabs there already, and they were earlier in the last century, they were subjects of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and later the British were ruling some of them, and the French. So yeah, there were Arabs there. They were living there. They had their own culture and language, and one of the things you can observe the newly minted Israelis doing is driving a lot of Arabs out of their cities, towns, and villages and confiscating their possessions and then taking away their books and manuscripts. And well, more on up to the present day, you can look at Russia's intention with its special military operation in Ukraine. If you read the statements by the Russian President Putin, he wants to eliminate Ukrainians as a national group. He wants to either kill them, which his army certainly has been doing, killing lots of civilians, and or make them, quote, go back, unquote, to being Russians and speaking only Russian and not speaking Ukrainian anymore as their language. And it certainly inflicts bad conditions of life, and it's taken away some Ukrainians, including some Ukrainian children, into Russia. So Russia could be accused of genocide or attempted genocide in the case of Ukraine.
Well, how can things like this be how can international law on matters like genocide be enforced?
Okay, well, there is now an international criminal court. It was set up by the United Nations. They did it in the time-honored way. They wrote a treaty and adopted the treaty and then sent it out to countries to sign and ratify. The treaty is called the Statute of Rome, Rome, capital of Italy, dated 1998. And what it said was, it's able to try especially severe crimes, including war crimes, if national courts, the courts of a particular country, fail to do it. And it said the way treaties commonly say, once this is signed and ratified by so and so many countries, I think in their case it was 20 countries, the court will come into existence. And so it came into existence in 2002, and it's located in The Hague, famous city in the Netherlands. And it now has 123 member countries, not the United States. The United States did something finky. It took part in writing the treaty, determining what the language of the treaty would be. And President Clinton signed it just at the end of his term, and I think it was the last day of December 2000. But then President Bush came in and he unsigned it. At least he said he was unsigning it. That the US would not be a signing party to it, and therefore not ratify it. And in fact, he went further. President Bush went further. This is the second George Bush, from 2001 on. And he got a special law passed called the American Servicepersons Protection Act. That said, essentially, the International Court could never try an American military person for war crimes. And so that meant, well, if somebody's a soldier, they feel like committing a war crime abroad, they can do it. And maybe a United States court will try them for it. Most often what we've seen is they don't get tried or they get acquitted. But they're, according to that American law, they're protected from ever being tried internationally for war crimes. I just want to mention one more treaty that I wish people would know about, and then you could ask me what I would like to see.
I think it's the one about the ultimate genocide, which would be the genocide of all people, the use of nuclear weapons.
The use of nuclear weapons. Yeah, a very recent treaty written in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it's been signed and ratified by 60 countries now. It went into effect when 50 countries signed it. So that was the beginning of 2020, 21, but hasn't been signed by any of the countries that actually have nuclear weapons. What it says is you can't use nuclear weapons. If you have them, you should get rid of them. And you shouldn't even threaten to use nuclear weapons. Now, we've seen threats from the US, we've seen threats from North Korea, we've seen threats from Russia. I'm not sure if we've seen threats from, say, France. France has nuclear weapons, but I don't know if France has it said recently, if you don't do such and such, we're going to blow you all up. But certainly some of the nuclear countries do make threats. And what I would like to see, well, I'd like to see all Americans know something about international law. In civics class, a lot of you were probably told how a bill becomes a law, but you weren't told how a bill fails to become a law. And you definitely weren't told how they get to be international laws. I'd like to see Americans make their government obey international laws and make their governments join in those treaties that they haven't yet signed and ratified. I'd like to see citizens be able to sue their governments in court if their governments don't provide the rights that are written down in international law. At the moment, that's very difficult, at least in the United States, because the United States uses a couple of fudge factors. The United States authorities say, yeah, we signed this treaty, but it's not automatic. It would only become part of our law if we passed a separate law saying, yes, it does become part of our law. But it really should be automatic. The country signs it and ratifies it. Immediately, it falls under the clause in the US Constitution that says treaties are the supreme law of the land.
Well, thank you, Wayles Browne, for a lot of information about international law and treaties and standards, many of which the United States does not live up to. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. A lot of work for lawyers and even for the rest of us who are not lawyers, but do take an interest in international law.
Political work.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.